Hi, I'm Vitor Manfrinato, and I'll be talking here about determining the resolution limits of e-beam lithography. This work is in a collaboration with my group, my advisors group, Karl Berggren at MIT, and also researchers at Argonne National Laboratory and Brookhaven National Laboratory. And they also funded this work, and this work was also funded by the the Energy Frontier Research Center at MIT, the Excitonics Center. So here I want to focus this talk about the resolution limits of e-beam. So I would like to understand the exposure components doing e-beam lithography, how this affects the point spread function, and how this would affect the fundamental resolution limits of electron beam lithography. So basically I want to quantify the exposure resolution limits of e-beam lithography. So to give you some background, I found these earliest reports of e-beam lithography where they wanted to do some transistors with it, and they used electron beam lithography. As you can see here, they picture an electron beam coming here, and here they show a radiated zone, which would mean that there's an uncertainty of what will be the feature size achieved and what will limit the feature size. And they discussed that feature size uncertainty. And we're still looking for this answer today. What will be the smallest feature size and how dense you can make a pattern? If you go forward, there was some interesting work on simulating the point spread function, which is the energy density deposited in the resist. And here, by this work from Murata and Kaiser, we see that they modeled the electron energy as a function of distance traveled. And you can see here that as the electron goes and travels to the resist, it loses energy. And they added another thing, is a jump from energy from E1 to E1 prime, which means that there was a generation of secondary electron. And they model the secondary electron effect on the point spread function. Furthermore, advancing a little bit more, you can see here this nice work by Richton and Kern, where they develop a technique to measure the lithographic PSF by doing single pixel exposures. So here will be the PSF, or the point spread function, in the resist. And furthermore, people have been studying and how to simulate by analytical formulas or by Monte Carlo simulation, how to predict and how to model this lithographic PSF. And here, what I want to do, basically, I wanted to directly measure all the important effects that limit the e-beam lithography point spread function. I'm going to use as my exposure system an aberration-corrected STEM, which is a scanning transmission electron microscope that has a really small spot size, 0.15 nanometer spot size at 200 kV. And I'm going to expose the resist, which is going to be HSQ, is hydrogen silicious coaxium. And this HSQ is going to be on top of a silicon nitride membrane, which is 10 nanometers thick here. Then, after exposure, we're going to do a development, a salty development, as developed by my previous lab mate, Joe Young. And after this development, I'm going to do a TEM metrology, previously described by my other lab mate, Hugo Aldouan. And this TEM metrology is going to enable a really high resolution imaging of the resulting structures. Here you have an example of the highest resolution features achieved by this technique. Over here you can see 2 nanometer feature sizes. This is a TEM micrograph where the dark area is HSQ and the last dark, the brighter area, it's silicon nitride, and you can see 2 nanometer wide silicon HSQ bridges. At the bottom here, we see a really nicely resolved 20 nanometer pitch. And on the corner here, we see a 10 nanometer pitch structure fabricated by this technique, which looks fairly better than previous results at 30 kV. And you can see more details about this in this reference. We also measured the lithographic PSF at 200 kV. So assuming a constant threshold dose and no chemical blurring effects, we measured the PSF, which is you do single pixel exposures, measure for each dose, you measure the radius and plot radius against 1 over the dose. And by doing this, you get the functional shape of the lithographic PSF. In order to study the effects of the substrate, if it matters having a really thin substrate or a very thick solid substrate, I did this Monte Carlo simulation where I have 10 nanometer thick silicon nitride as doing this study, and I also have another substrate which is a 300 micrometer thick silicon. As you can see here, the PSF start to differ only for radius larger than 50 nanometers. So for radius smaller than 50 nanometers, the PSF on a bulk substrate or on a membrane looks the same. Then my approach is like this. The basic problem here is that once you have an electron coming down inside the resist, there could be an inelastic scattering deflecting the primary electron beam and losing energy epsilon here. And that energy loss, it would be due to excitation of other particles. It could generate an electron or a secondary electron, what people call usually. It could generate surface and volume plasmons, phonons, photons, and excitons. And as you can see, this is a very complex problem, and I'm going to focus this study of the effects or the phenomena that has highest probability, which is basically the generation of secondary electrons and generation of volume plasmons. What I want to do is to measure the radial distribution of deposited energy for each component, which means I want to see the energy deposited by the direct and primary beam, direct beam. I also want to measure the energy deposited by the propagation of volume plasmons and secondary electrons. First, to measure the direct beam PSF, I'm going to use an energy filter TEM, which consists on, you have a sample on the top here, and the electron, after it went through the sample, the electron will lose energy and is going to enter in the spectrometer here, which we have a magnetic field that bends the electron depending on the energy of electrons. So depending on the energy loss, this electron is going to undergo a different circumference. And then you can add a slit here by selecting the specific energy loss that you want to study. And then after the slit, you put a CCD here and you image what is the spot size looks like after a given energy loss. To give you an example of our measurements, here is again our system, HSQ. It's going to be 20 nanometers thick, silicon nitride, 10 nanometers thick, and you have the incident electron coming here and being scattered by, there's a deflection of electron by a distance r and energy loss epsilon. And basically, I image the spot size, the electrons, after it went through the sample. So imaging transmitted electrons. Here you see how the electron looks like after these electrons lost 20 eV. So for a 20 eV energy loss, this is how the spot size looks like after the sample. And I can do this for many different energy losses and see how the electrons lose energy as a function of position. And by using a imaging lens with a achromatic, basically using a achromatic imaging lens, I could do a fair comparison between the spot size at different energies. Because in this case, I don't have chromatic or spherical aberration because we used a specific TM in Argonne National Lab. And here I see, I plot to you the average of all energy loss. Here we have the total energy loss in the resist actually from 5 to 120 eV. And you see how the energy loss occurs as a function of radius position. So this is what I call direct-beam PSF. Furthermore, I'm going to study the other components. For example, here, by using electron energy loss spectroscopy, or EOS, I can measure the electron count as a function of energy loss of transmitted electrons. Here at 0 eV, we have electrons that didn't lose any energy. It's the largest peak for this sample. And at around 20 eV, I have a large peak here. And then after this large peak, where there's a big tail after 20. So what will be that large peak at 20 eV? This is what usually people call the volume plasma, which is the collective motion of free electrons or valence electrons in the case of a dielectric or insulator or a semiconductor that propagate in the volume of the solid. Here I have a schematics from the paper from Ricci, where he do a schematics of how the volume plasma looks like. What he plotted is the displacement, what he plotted was the displacement of electron clouds in the material. So you imagine that you have electrons at the center of each of these little circles. And at here, you have a large displacement of electrons. And here, you don't have any displacement. So basically, when an electron comes here, it will excite this collective motion of electron clouds, which has this wavelength, and this constitutes the volume plasma. So we know that that collective resonance in HSQ is at 22.5 eV. It's quite high energy. And we note here that volume plasmas could generate secondary electrons that could further expose the resist, or this volume plasma could directly break a bond and ionize the resist, so it could directly expose the resist. So we're going to treat the volume plasma propagation as like this. You have the direct beam coming through the resist, and perpendicular to the direct beam, we're going to have a volume plasma, which we're going to treat as a cylindrical wave originated from the direct beam. And I would like to measure how this volume plasma deposits energy in the resist. So here's again the volume plasma peak as we discussed it, and we're going to consider that everything else here, it will be due to generation of secondary electrons. So to measure the volume plasma PSF, I have here a focused view on the user spectrum intensity or electron count as a function of energy loss. So here we have the volume plasma peak. And then by using a Kramer-Kronig analysis, I could calculate the index of refraction, N and K, for electromagnetic wave at many different energies. So for instance, considering an electromagnetic wave at 22.5 eV, I can calculate the index, the N and K. And the K is basically related to, is the extinction coefficient, which is related to the decay length of that electromagnetic wave at 22.5 eV. So I consider that the volume plasma at 22.5 eV decays just like an electromagnetic wave at 22.5 eV. And then I can extrapolate basically the decay length of volume plasmas. And here I plot to you the intensity as a function of radius of how the volume plasma dissipates energy inside the material. And I call this the volume plasma PSF. In order to understand the effect of secondary electrons, we didn't measure directly the whole of only secondary electrons in the PSF. So we did the Monte Carlo modeling of the PSF, including secondary electrons. And a basic question is, what kind of model should we use to characterize, to understand how secondary electrons deposit energy inside the resist? So here we plotted the PSF using in red the inelastic scattering model in Murata's paper. And we also chose to model the PSF using the Moeller plus Vrien's inelastic scattering model in blue. They have a certain difference, and the difference is that the Moeller plus Vrien's model has a higher cross-section leading to a wider PSF. Nevertheless, we chose to use forward the inelastic scattering model because we compared results of lithographic PSF with simulations, and previously this model, the inelastic scattering model, agreed really well with our results. So going on, I'm going to try to put everything together here. So we want to understand the energy density deposit in the resist by electron beam lithography. Here I plotted again the lithographic PSF with a fitting function. And I also plotted in blue the direct-beam PSF that I measured before. And you see there's a quite big difference between them. And this difference is mainly due to delocalized energy transfer in the resist. So you have electrons that went through, lost energy inside the resist, but these electrons created secondary electrons in volume plasma, which will propagate and basically propagate and do a loss in resolution in E-beam. Here I plotted again the volume plasma PSF, the direct-beam PSF, and the Monte Carlo PSF, including secondary electrons. As you can see that the direct-beam PSF around here on the top is the widest component for radius smaller than 1 nanometer. What that means is that independent of secondary electron emission or volume plasma emission, the spot size and electron scattering, it will dominate the fabrication, dominate the resolution of smaller structures. Or in other words, the fabrication of small isolated structures by E-beam will be dominated by the spot size and electron scattering. So what about for radius larger than 1 nanometer? Here I try to compare the effect of volume plasmas and secondary electrons. We measure by yields that the volume plasmas correspond to 35% of energy loss. And we consider that the other 65% is due to secondary electrons. Then we perform an energy balanced normalization of these two PSFs. So by considering the volume plasma PSF and the spot size, and by considering the secondary electron PSF and the spot size in the tool, here I plotted the energy density deposited by volume plasmas and by secondary electrons. So you can see here that volume plasma has a larger contribution than secondary electrons for radius larger than 2 nanometers. So what that means is that the volume plasma will give you a harder time to make higher resolution dense structures by E-beam lithography in this range. And then here I plotted the lithographic PSF data against the sum of volume plasma effect and secondary electron effect. This is the green curve, and you can see that this green curve has a relative good agreement with the lithographic PSF data. So therefore, for this range from 2 to 12 nanometers, I would say that in HSQ, volume plasma are more limiting than secondary electrons. To conclude, we measured for the first time delocalized energy transfer in electron beam lithography using a chromatic aberration-corrected EFTEM. We also studied the role of plasmons in electron beam lithography. We defined the role of spot size, electron scattering, secondary electrons in volume plasmons. And I would like to note here that the secondary electron PSF simulated And the measured volume plasma PSF might be important to EUV lithography, for example, because it's known that EUV generates secondary electrons and may also generate plasmons in the resist. So this study could be also used to understand the resolution limits of EUV lithography. Thank you very much. And if you'd like to ask any questions, you can email me at vitor@mit.edu. And here's the reference of this work that has been recently published. Thank you very much.